if you look at the roof in the middle, you'll see a coat of arms with the caption Imperium et Libertas, Empire and Freedom, which of course from the perspective that I'm going to talk to you from is an irresolvable contradiction. Viabella was just telling me, as our chair mentioned, that her plane was attacked by birds. She was coming here, but she clarified to me that these were Indian birds attacking a Virgin Atlantic airplane. I guess that's as close as a revolutionary action that we can get in our times. But there were times when one need not speak of alert citizens, but rather people would speak of revolution and revolutionaries. And what I'm going to do is to tell you a story of that time, 1960s, 1970s, but a story that I believe is quite relevant for us, all of us, but particularly for Latin Americans right now. Is a story of the 1970s. It's a story that involves that man, that bearded man, lots of bearded men at the time, an Argentinian writer named Julio Cortázar. And he got involved in what I believe is a really good and interesting actual example of both democratizing politics while decolonizing citizenship. So let me tell you that story very quickly, and I'll pepper the story with a few commentaries of my own. In December 1973, in the wake of the coup d'etat that unseated the socialist president of Chile, Salvador Allende, next year is going to be the 40th anniversary of that September 11, writers Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Julio Cortázar were invited to participate in the second Russell Tribunal. The tribunal was a citizens' initiative aimed at considering and passing judgment on the intervention of big powers in Latin America. The first one had dealt with the intervention of big powers in Vietnam, and that connection was explicitly made at the time between Vietnam, what was happening in South Asia, and what was happening in Latin America. And we think we're globalized. The tribunal, as I said, was a citizens' initiative aimed at considering and passing judgment on the intervention of big powers in Latin America. In the course of their work for the tribunal, Garcia Marquez, Cortázar, and others extended, developed, and radicalized the critique of colonialism initiated by Jean-Paul Sartre on the basis of work being done by Caribbean writers at the time, and the members of the first Russell Tribunal, which they applied to the Vietnam situation. It's a beautiful triangulation. It's a beautiful circulation of thought from the Caribbean to Europe, then to Vietnam, and then back to the Americas. In doing so, they linked the call to take race and other forms of identity seriously as factors of systemic oppression with the violence of financial capitalism and the attempt to establish a global hegemony, a one-world form of globally integrated capitalism, as Sartre, quoting Fanon, put it at the time. This talk will present the experience of the Russell Tribunals as an actual instance of the decolonization of citizenship, concerned with the limits of the purely formal, of the purely formality of human rights approaches that appeal to depoliticized notions of global citizenship. My standpoint is that politics and ethics are inseparable, responded Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar to the question posited by journalist Jorge Raventos about the political function of people's activism in general, and righteous activism in particular, in the face of oppression and violence. Cortázar's stance was characteristic of an engagement with politics in Latin American cultural and literary criticism that coincided with radical attempts in practice, the level of the state and the law, to build independent state institutions and make them work in a non-statal mode. Such attempts were interrupted by the unleashing of counter-revolutionary violence and the imposition of an economic model that resulted in the naturalization of inequality, mass human rights violations, and the depoliticization of society, beginning with Chile in the mid-70s, and if we are to believe Vela, ending with India today, or continuing in India today. This violent interruption was echoed in the so-called ethical turn in literary and cultural production, which marked a withdrawal from and a renunciation of politics and the popular, which lasted from the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s until at least the time of the War on Terror. The withdrawal of literary and cultural criticism from politics has been explored quite recently by a series of formidable books published in the Americas, among them John Beverly's Latin Americanism after 9/11, the collection The Ethics of Latin American Criticism, edited by Erin Graf Savin, and Bruno Bostil's Marx and Freud in Latin America. These critical interventions differ in scope and approach, but they all focus in diverse ways on the turn that took place in the Americas and elsewhere throughout the 1980s and 90s, which culminated in the rhetoric of the War on Terror. Again, the kind of a story that Bella told us a few minutes ago. Specifically, they deal, these new books, deal with a period in which revolutionary engagements with the states were dismantled in the name of law and order, free market economics, and individual liberty, which resulted in the elevation of an ethics of care for the other over and against political efforts to bring about justice and transformation. Although different, in these works there is a more or less implicit contrast, which I am trying to make explicit, between the ethical turn and the current depoliticized language of human rights, and the depoliticization of the times of terror on the one hand, and on the other the inseparability between politics and ethics referred to by Cortázar in that 1974 interview. In this talk I will explore that contrast. I will focus on the inseparability thesis put forward by Cortázar. I'll argue that the inseparability of politics and ethics is characteristic of a specific form of speech and writing that originated in practical instances of people's activism and citizenship's decolonization, such as the Russell Tribunals of the late 60s and early 70s. That form of speech and writing emerged, in turn, against the backdrop of revolutionary attempts like the Cuban Revolution, the student mobilizations of the late 60s, the Chilean Revolution, and the renewal of armed struggle that followed the events of September 11, 1973. It can be opposed to the merging of counter-revolutionary violence, law and order, and free market culture that became the norm throughout the continent and elsewhere in the world after the coup d'etat in Chile in 1973. As such, this specific form of speech and writing is distinguishable from and can be set against a different form of cultural production, the one that withdraws away from the national popular and into the ivory tower of its own values and ambitions in the formulation of models of identity, governability, and development. The ethics of this form of cultural production, the ethics underpinning the form of cultural production and governmental practice, as Bella just pointed out, consists of a celebration of the different roles allowed by free market culture. It entails a rejection of social conflict on the basis that individuals try to maximize their comparative advantages in the marketplace without obliging others to give up their own interests, and the canonization of values of moderation, consensus, and respect for the other, proper of a fractureless time defined by the protocols of democratic and legal formalism, governance, the order of the oikos, of the economic and the domestic, progress and normalization. In the situation created by this process of social normalization, which is our current situation, law and order acquire all the connotations of a default vitalist ideology subjecting individuals at their innermost level, so that society's conflicts are substituted by a personal defense of the homogeneity of essences and the transcendental purity of the categories God, fatherland, and family, but also property. As Nellie Richard, whom I just quoted, has observed in relation to the exemplary case of contemporary Chile, in such a situation, the norms usually associated with the maternal and the familiar, the oikos, the home, the economy, are extended into what in Spanish is known as lo patrio, the fatherland, instead of the national popular state or society, configuring a practice and rhetoric that is in fact patriarchal and militaristic, which elevates the national interest to the canonical role of a supreme good to be defended by the necessary sacrifice of the many against the risk of dissolution, anarchic violence, and revolution. The aim of this practice and rhetoric would be to protect traditional norms and conventions, the familiar, against signs of rupture, fracture, or catastrophe. These signs, in turn, are oftentimes projected upon and embodied by the people and the masses. Again, the story that we just heard. The figure of the internal or external enemy that threatens to dissolve the purity of the nation, the family, and the economy. The rhetorical practice that in this paper is distinguished from and opposed by the inseparability thesis espoused by Cortázar and others back in the 70s is supplemented in this way by a sharp demarcation between positive and negative values, which serves the guardians of order to consolidate their benevolent ethics as their dogmatic basis and foundation. Ultimately, what the so-called ethical turn rejects is the need for a struggle, political struggle in all its forms to make society at all possible. In the remainder of this paper, I will invite you to consider the inseparability thesis as both a recognition in theory and practice of struggle as a constructive condition of society and the kernel of a specific form of speech and writing in Latin America and other places that goes beyond the strictures of territory and dogmatic geopolitical imagination, in fact freeing the latter in the direction of global justice and the future. In this respect, to recover the memory of this specific form of speech and writing committed to political practice and struggle does not correspond to a nostalgic affect, but rather attests to and becomes part of the various returns of politics that in Latin America, particularly, and elsewhere, are nowadays attempting to build once more a society and a state that is at once egalitarian and diverse, a state of the people, especially after 2008 and 2011. Let me now turn quickly to the struggle and the legacy, to the question of the struggle and the legacy of the Russell Tribunal. Cortázar's full answer to the question of the political function of popular activism, with which I began this paper, was published in the Argentinian journal Redacción, and goes like this. My standpoint is that politics and ethics are inseparable, even though practice tends to show the opposite. Because of that, I understand that in playing an essentially ethical and moral role, the Russell Tribunal is at the same time doing a political job that I fully support. The witnesses that come to this tribunal narrate the monstrous experiences they have suffered under the regimes in power in Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Paraguay. These witnesses are questioned by jurists whose work is recognized around the world, helping us appreciate the validity of each testimony. I was part of the jury, says Cortázar, and my personal conclusions were the result of listening to these people, witnesses, and rapporteurs. Out of this accumulation of testimonies resulted a sentence, the People's Tribunal's sentence, that could only have been unanimous, reached by a jury that included, among others, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Armando Uribe, Laurent Schwartz, Alfred Kastler, and Lelio Basso. That's Cortázar. In this paragraph, Cortázar was describing the construction of a form of speech and writing that was at once subjective and collective, united in its ethical political function and diverse, profoundly personal as well as egalitarian and mostly all popular. In fact, he was describing a process in which witnesses, rapporteurs, judges, jury, and the public stopped being subjects for the norms imposed on them as existential determinants, being victims, culpable of bad behavior, defeated exiles, disillusioned losers, and so on. And since the imposition of such norms had taken place in the banal space that makes the streets of any city into actual tribunals, only a people's tribunal, the reverse of the banality of street judgment and identification with the law, putting forward a different politicized judgment, could make the conflict of judgments explicit, the struggle, and reveal the subjects of the law and the norm as instead incalculable subjects that the authority cannot simply identify, unify, and place. The street as tribunal was accurately described in the 1960s by Latin American author Frantz Fanon in the formula of interpellation, "Look, a Negro, Mama, see the Negro." I'm frightened. It was no longer a question of being aware of my body in the third person, but in a triple person. I was responsible for my body, my race, my ancestors. We should add to Fanon's description for my poverty. I'm responsible for not wanting to be better off. Isn't that what I'm told by capital? The banality of the situation, an encounter between a black person and a small white kid in the street, indicates that the whole of society has been redrawn on the model of the legal tribunal, all the way to the street level, and that the law has been turned into a principle of identification, of selection and relegation. If so, if the banal, legalistic, normalizing process of identification takes place in the spectacle of desire of the gaze, the child looking at the black person in front of him, from the boy looking anxious at the black man to window shopping and television, what is now called aspirational culture, and the limits of language, then a counter-spectacle and a counter-speech coming from the edge of meaning and being can open up the space for de-identification and decolonization. In the case of the Russell Tribunal, this was the gray area opened up by the very existence of a people's tribunal between justice and judicial procedure, where a conflict of judgments is played out and incalculable subjects emerge out of the struggle. Let us not forget, however, that the banal scene of the street is also the place of violence, for it is here, in the street, where the ethics of Manichaean anxiety that characterized not only the colonial world, but from the late 70s onwards has come to dominate the images and language of war and terror, becomes concrete and applied, with the force of intervening armies, covert operations, and riot police upon the poor who dare dreaming reality, or the mulatto who dares becoming president, and the masses who dare becoming new women and new men, and in doing so dare to speak. This is a new kind of political speech alluded to by Cortázar, a speech originated from the recognition and critique of Manichaean ethics and norms, us versus them, the West versus the rest, the same versus the other, as a symptom of uneven development lived by concrete peoples as a tension of meaning and being, an existential tension. He referred to such political speech as an accumulation of testimonies, a series of speech acts uttered by social actors, not victims, that stood up to governments and the global forces propping them in order to make their own history, and did so again in the space of the tribunal to write it down themselves. Far from imposing their own values and voices, writers and intellectuals like Cortázar and Garcia Marquez in the Russell Tribunal, this is a picture from the Russell Tribunal, on the left-hand side, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, on the right-hand side, Juan Bosch, former president and also of the Dominican Republic and author. Far from imposing their own values and voices, writers and intellectuals like Cortázar and Garcia Marquez in the Russell Tribunal, but also José Revueltas and Paco Ignacio Taibo in Mexico after 1968, or León Rosigner and Ariel Dorfman in Argentina and Chile in the wake of military takeovers, describe their action and function as firstly and foremost, and very simply, listening. Their act of listening, Cortázar points out, was ethical, both in the sense of resigning any or renouncing to any vanguard or leadership position, any power claim related to their being in possession of knowledge or the letter, and in the sense of raising consciousness, but also at the same time political. The latter in the sense of making the testimonies public, validating them. This is one of the specific roles played by jurists in the tribunal. The other was to reclaim the law from the hands of judicial systems and experts appropriated by governments and economic interests, and issuing a collective declaration of refusal and condemnation, the sentence, that was also a demand and a call to arms, as expressed by Frantz Fanon in the phrase, "get ready to attack," or by Cortázar himself in this beautiful phrase, "let the typewriters of free men open fire once more." In such declarations, presented as a tribunal's judgment, the negative force of the refusal, denunciation, and condemnation was balanced by and transmuted into a constructive operation of salvage, after the catastrophic unleashing of violence on the population, and the positive force of the act of creating rights out of people's demands, subtended by political militancy. Implicit in all this was the recognition of the subaltern position of those who came to the tribunal and made it what it was, which extended all the way from the nature of the testimonials to the very subaltern character of the tribunal itself operating in non-statal mode. Obviously, said Cortázar, that sentence has no possible immediate application, he observed. Recognizing the distance between the tribunal's judgment of adjudication in the states currently in the hands of governments propped up by economic, transnational, and national interests, and the disempowerment that comes with such a distance. And yet, said Cortázar, speaking of the political function of the tribunal's sentence, it represents the most forceful refusal of the infinite violations of human rights perpetrated by the regimes that pretend, emphasis on pretend, to govern the countries mentioned above. It is also a firm condemnation of the North American imperialism that props them. That's Cortázar. Cortázar was alluding not only to the possibility that the speaking subalterns, witnesses, and rapporteurs could come to occupy the position of an institution oftentimes typical of the state, the tribunal, but the actuality of such an act. The Russell Tribunal was itself an act of becoming the state by the subalterns, who refused to recognize and effectively displace the authority of the governments of Chile, Brazil, or the US. Let us conclude that in doing so, in specifying the tribunal and its sentence, the action of speaking against silence or being silenced as itself a political act in which those who are being silenced refuse to be so and instead stand up, speak up, and become judges of the governments and the economic model doing the silencing, Cortázar was setting the stage for a wider debate. The debate that attempts and still attempts to resolve the question, what happens when the subaltern becomes the state? As in today's Bolivia, for instance. This wasn't merely a theoretical exercise, for the question was prompted by what had happened with the Chilean Revolution, the year immediately prior to the meeting of the tribunal. But otherwise, the question was this: if the political position of refusal, which Cortázar recognized as leftist or revolutionary in general, today after postmodernism and so on, we will have to say subaltern, post-colonial, or socialist, or whatever, generally rules out in advance the possibility of occupying or engaging with the state to make it work in a non-statal mode from popular subaltern positions, what are then the options left? The answer, and I will finish with this, as contemporary critics like Weberly or Bostiels observe, is that only two alternatives would remain. That is to say, only two alternatives would remain if we accept the idea that the political position of refusal generally rules out in advance the possibility of occupying the state. Two alternatives. One is prudent liberalism or neoconservatism, on the one hand. I would have to clarify what is, what unites them and distinguishes them, but we don't have time for that. The other is ultra-leftism. Interestingly, Cortázar would go on to develop the implications of this dilemma in his further reflections on the Chilean case, once more against the backdrop of the Russell Tribunal. Crucially, similar concerns have been brought to the fore nowadays by critics and writers in the Americas in relation to the dilemmas confronted by the left-leaning governments of the so-called pink wave, or Maria Rosada. Elsewhere, I have emphasized against liberals, neoconservative, and postmodern skeptics, or post-hegemony skeptics, that these governments are involved in constructive projects of state building and national popular sovereignty that cannot be separated from a regional affirmation of Latin America as a transnational entity. Because of these, the two options that Cortázar criticized in his time, the liberal conservative and the ultra-leftist, are for today's left-leaning governments and students in Chile or Colombia, as Cortázar correctly and presciently suggested, no options at all. The suggestion here is that Cortázar's inseparability thesis and the legacy of the Russell Tribunal are no mere curiosities, but are totally relevant to the question of the state, the people, or the peoples, and the priority of the political nowadays. In this sense, to conclude, let us speak of the persistence of politics over and against ethical articulations of rights, laws, and the norms and values of the oikos and the other, in relation to the challenges confronted by left-leaning governments in places like Venezuela, Brazil, or Bolivia, and protesters and social movements in the streets of Chile, Mexico, Colombia, but also perhaps India. Thank you very much.